In 1346, on the distant shores of the Black Sea, a Mongol army was dying of a disease they did not understand. But in their desperation, they invented a new kind of warfare. One that used terror itself as a weapon. The real enemy wasn't the Mongol horseman. It was this. A flea. And inside its gut, a bacterial passenger called Yersinia pestis. A perfect, microscopic killer. As his men fell, the Mongol commander Janibeg made a monstrous decision. He ordered the corpses of his dead catapulted over the walls of the besieged Genos trading port of Caffa. It was the first documented act of biological warfare. And it unleashed hell on earth. The few Italian merchants who escaped Caffa didn't know they were carrying stowaways. In the grain stores and woolen cloth of their galleys, black rats, and their infected fleas, began a westward journey. In October 1347, the fleet made landfall in Sicily. The witnesses described sailors with sickness clinging to their very bones. They were covered in dark, oozing boils and coughed-up blood. The harbormaster tried to turn them away, but it was too late. The rats were already coming ashore. This was the plague's beachhead. With the speed of a tidal wave, it spread. Not at the pace of a walking man, but at the speed of a sailing ship. To Constantinople. To Alexandria. Up the Italian boot. By early 1348, it was in Marseille. The silent invasion was over. The slaughter was about to begin. The plague wasn't one disease, it was three, a trinity of terror. And it offered its victims a choice of doors, each more horrific than the last. The most common was the bubonic plague, carried by the flea bite. The bacteria would travel to the lymph nodes, here, in the armpit, or the groin, or the neck, and begin to multiply. The body would swell into a grotesque, painful egg called a bubo. The fever was relentless. The stench of the dying bubo was said to be unbearable. Death came in about 80% of cases, within a week. But if the bacteria reached the lungs, it became the pneumonic plague. This was the killer's most efficient form. It spread through the air, on a cough, a breath. There were no buboes. Just a raging fever, a bloody cough, and almost certain death within 48 hours. A single gasp in a crowded room could doom a dozen people. And finally, the rarest and most terrifying door, the septicemic plague. Here, the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. It was a death sentence measured in hours. The body's circulatory system would shut down, causing internal bleeding and gangrene. The skin would turn a deep, blotchy purple-black. It was this symptom that gave the pandemic its name, the Black Death. There was no cure. There was no understanding. One day you were healthy, the next, you were dead. The sheer speed and violence of the disease shattered all sense of order. It felt like the world itself was sick. The systems of society began to collapse, starting with the most basic, what to do with the dead. Mass graves, called plague pits, were dug. Burying crews worked day and night. The chronicler Agnolo di Tura of Siena wrote, "I buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so many died that all believed it was the end of the world." The doctors were useless. Their beaked masks, filled with pungent herbs to ward off miasma, were a terrifying symbol of a profession utterly out of its depth. Their cures, bloodletting, potions, rubbing onions on the buboes, were as effective as praying to the wind. The church, the bedrock of medieval life, was powerless. Priests died in droves because they administered last rites. People died without confession, a terrifying prospect that fueled spiritual panic. If God was allowing this, was he even listening? The economic engine of Europe seized. Fields lay fallow. Harvests rotted. With up to half the labor force dead, the feudal system, built on a vast base of serfs, began to crack. The few workers left were suddenly very valuable. In this vacuum of hope, extremism flourished. Groups like the Flagellants emerged. They believed the plague was God's wrath for human sin, and that by publicly whipping themselves, they could atone for all of humanity. They were a terrifying, mobile cult of pain, often whipping up mobs to attack Jews and other scapegoats. Humanity, reeling from a blow it couldn't comprehend, needed someone to blame. The most devastating target was Europe's Jewish population. A vicious conspiracy theory spread that Jews were poisoning the wells. It was nonsense, of course. Jews died from the plague at the same rate as everyone else. But logic was a casualty of the pandemic. The rumor provided a simple, evil answer to an impossibly complex question. The result was a pogrom of unimaginable cruelty. From Basel to Strasbourg, thousands of Jews were rounded up, given sham trials, and burned alive. In the city of Mainz, 6,000 were killed. In Strasbourg, 2,000 were burned on a single wooden platform. It was one of the darkest chapters of the Holocaust to come. Some communities chose a different end. In a castle in Chillon, and in homes across Germany, groups of Jews committed mass suicide rather than renounce their faith or be killed by the mob. The stain of this persecution would linger for centuries. Amid the silence of the grave, a few voices spoke for the dead. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, a collection of stories told by 10 nobles who fled the city to wait out the plague. His opening description of Florence is one of the most chilling first-hand accounts ever written. A new, dark art was born. The Danse Macabre showed skeletons leading people from all walks of life to the grave. The Triumph of Death depicted death as an unstoppable, egalitarian force. Art no longer focused solely on God, it now stared directly into the void. And the rulers took notice. The scale of death was recorded in dry, bureaucratic language that barely concealed the terror. In England, King Edward III passed the Statute of Labourers, a desperate attempt to freeze wages and force the surviving peasants back to work for pre-plague pay. It was a ticking time bomb. But you cannot legislate against demography. With half the population gone, the value of human labor had skyrocketed. For the first time, a common serf could demand payment for his work. He could leave his lord's manor for a better offer. The foundations of feudalism weren't just cracked, they were crumbling to dust. The plague finally receded, though it would return in waves for centuries. But the Europe it left behind in 1351 was unrecognizable from the one of 1346. It was a quieter, emptier continent. But from the ashes of the old world, a new one was struggling to be born. The common person who survived was, for the first time, in a position of power. Wages rose dramatically. Diets improved as more land became available for pasture. The rigid social hierarchy began to soften. The immense psychological trauma also broke the medieval mindset, creating a space for new ways of thinking. That newfound power would not be given back quietly. In 1381, just a generation after the plague, the peasants' revolt erupted in England. Rebels, led by Wat Tyler, marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom. They were crushed, but the genie was out of the bottle. The old order was dying. The plague, in its horrific, world-shattering way, had cleared the path. It broke the economic model of feudalism. It weakened the power of the church. It created a labor shortage that spurred technological innovation. The world that emerged was more skeptical, more questioning, and more focused on the individual. It was a world ripe for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Age of Discovery. The Black Death killed an estimated 25 million people in Europe alone, perhaps half the population. It was the single greatest catastrophe in recorded history. And its shadow is long. The bacterium Yersinia pestis still exists in rodent populations around the world, a permanent resident on our planet. The story of the Black Death is not just a tale of medieval horror. It is a stark lesson in the fragility of our systems, the speed with which our world can unravel, and the terrifying, world-altering power of the smallest things. The fleas, the rats, the ships, the breath, a reminder that history can turn on the smallest of hinges.